Joseph, the European Central Bank at long last has started its purchases of asset-backed securities. Are there any early signs of how this is going?
Well, it's going to be a bit too early to know how much they've bought. They only began on Friday. But we did hear about what kind of ABS they'd be buying. And it's fairly interesting. I mean, we've written about this before in terms of what the ECB wants to do, or had wanted to do, which is to basically transfer risk away from bank balance sheets by buying securitizations from them and then freeing up capital for those banks to lend to the eurozone economy. And that's how you get inflation up. The issue, though, is even though they've just begun ABS purchases, inflation keeps dropping. Growth next year is looking quite low. And also on Friday, Mario Draghi himself said, we will do what we must to raise inflation. And that really means one thing: asset purchases in much greater size than the ABS they could buy.
So this is the kind of the two objections, I guess, to ABS purchases. First, that there aren't that many of them in Europe, and so it might not make much difference. And second, it's all very well freeing up capital on banks' balance sheets, but the banks always say that this isn't a question of supply; it's a question of demand, and that the borrowers don't want to borrow money, and it's very difficult for the ECB to force that. But if we take the first question, if there's not enough ABS around, what else might the ECB buy?
Well, actually, I think the second question you've raised there is quite important, because if there is no demand, the basic issue is because borrowers really aren't feeling wealthy enough to actually borrow from the banks. How can you fix that? Well, you can maybe do it by raising asset prices, equities, sort of credit as well. And if you do that, well, you can really only do that by buying lots of assets. So you guess you do go beyond ABS, but that goes back to your first question: what can they buy instead? And you are buying fairly low risk stuff to push banks and sort of other participants in the economy into buying higher risk stuff. So maybe the ECB can buy investment grade corporate debt. That sounds great, but there's really only about 450 billion euros of sort of liquid investment grade corporate debt out there. That sounds like a big number, but if you're trying to buy, 20 billion or so euros a month perhaps, that gets eaten up quite quickly.
And how about other types of corporate debt, high yield debt? Would they buy that?
Well, the ECB, we know from how they regard ABS that they'd like to buy, doesn't really like the idea of taking too much balance sheet risk, which perhaps makes high yield beyond the pale for them. But it may not be for investors. If they see the ECB buying corporate debt and perhaps sovereign debt in order to push investors into higher risk stuff, well, you can take the cue and you can buy high yield euro credits, or you can buy leveraged loans even, in the expectation that corporate activity takes off again in the eurozone. There is a problem, however, because the economy isn't great in the eurozone. Yields on government debt are low. This has pushed people already into high yield, and high yield is not quite what it used to be. 4% is really the norm. And the character investor has changed. They're much more buy and hold. That has affected liquidity. And you can see in a few recent blow-ups when high yield bonds have just suddenly dropped in price on some sort of bad corporate news, that's a much flightier investor actually. There's no sort of buffer in the market of liquidity. So it's slightly fragile out there.
Difficult choices then for the ECB, whichever way it turns. Joseph, thanks very much.